had a small audience, but an interesting one. You need it? Not loud enough?
Okay. So, we can't do anything about this noise.
If you keep it close to your mouth, just cut down the
But
stand.
it's even worse. The close.
We will hear it.
Not that close.
We will hear
How about
it.
here?
1 inch.
Here?
About an inch.
Okay. So, I gave an ad hoc talk at the community builders, and I made some mistakes, and so I sent him a correction, and he was kind enough to publish that. What I wanted to do was to repeat some of those points and sort of try to bring it together in a better way. But first I wanted to read a couple of, a few couplets from Iqbal, which tell us about the condition today. Because I said to Wasi Bhai, I said my topic will be Iqbal in the context of today, which was actually what other Bhai had suggested. So this is from Bangidara. Ye mushtaqan hadise khwajae badro hunayn awat. Tasarruf aaye binhash wa chashm ashkar amad. So here he is saying that tell the stories of the Muslims of the past. Tell it so that people may become aware of their forebearers, of what they did and how they did that. That tarkeeb-e ummat-e Hashmi, that unique way of the Prophet, unparalleled in the history of mankind, that unique and specific way in which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did his things. And you know those things. So he's saying, tell them about that Hadise Khwajae Badru Hunayn Awar, the battles of Badr and Hunayn. And they're quite opposite if you read about Badr and Hunayn. Why? Because Jahane no ho raha hai paida, wo alame peer mar raha hai, jise farangi muqamaron ne bana diya hai Umar Khan. That this casino that has in this world has been made into a casino by the Western powers. That time, that era, that civilization is dying. So you tell them about the hadith or the story of Hunayn and Badr. So they may be re-inspired as this civilization dies. And you can see it is dying, the whole world is dying around us because of this civilization. The plants are dying, the earth is dying, the water is polluted. Isn't it? There hasn't been a greater threat to life, not human life, animal life and plant life ever since human activity started in this. And what will happen then? Karenge ahle nazar taza bastiyan abad, meri nigah nahi sue Kufa o Baghdad. खरीद सकते हैं दुनिया में इशरत परवेज, खुदा की देन है सरमाए गमे फरहाद. That the real love, Farhad and Shireen, that's the story, that's the classical story of love in Persian literature. You cannot imbibe that love. You can buy these things that are the worldly goods that the West buys today, but you cannot buy that love, that desire that is permeant. So with this opening, I want to say something that the way we want to convey to a Western audience. Unfortunately, we don't have many of those here, but maybe you can convey this if you think it is appropriate. And that is to say that how does the Western mind look at Iqbal? And people have written many superficial books about this. But what I want to bring to you is an understanding of how they would relate to their mujtahids, those who have done ijtihad in the West. not Muslims, but non-Muslims. And the first one that comes to my mind that has some correlation with Iqbalian thought for his own people. And again, I'm not trying to say that Iqbal has borrowed from him. He lived before the time of Iqbal, so he couldn't have borrowed from Iqbal. But Iqbal read him because he wrote in German. And this man is, I don't know how many of you can pronounce it, but my wife can. His name is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe. And he lived for 82 years as opposed to Iqbal's 61. So he had a long life and he saw a lot of things and did a lot of things, good and bad and indifferent. He even fought a war against Napoleon's revolutionary army. 1449 to 1832. So he was in the 18th, 19th century, in between. He was a civil servant, and then he, as I said, he fought that war. He was influenced by Schiller. By the way, we live between two streets. One is called Schiller, and it's called Goethe. Goethe on one side, and then Banks, and then Schiller. So we're in between two German philosophers. And Fichte. And then Humboldt was the one who started the beginnings of new sciences and investigation of nature. But his most famous work is Faust. And if you look at some of the hadiths, there is a parallel about the Jewish brothers who left their sister with one of the pious men, and then what happened after that. So I think it's worth reading Faust. But he also wrote, which you will not find in Wikipedia, he wrote this Ostleicher Divan, which is, he was influenced by Persian poetry, by Hafiz and others, and so he wrote this number of things. One of them was Huri, and Iqbal wrote in response to that in Peyam-e-Mashriq, and Peyam-e-Mashriq is really a response to that, is about Huri and Shair.
I thought it was Goethe and response to Goethe.
Yes, Ostleicher Divan. Yeah. So then, but his most interesting one is the River of Muhammad, or Muhammad's Gizan. And I have given the talk on this one time before at Community Builder, so I won't repeat it. Except that Iqbal then wrote in response to that a poem called Juya. And it flows like a river. It flows like a stream if you read it. It's in Persian. Banigar bajue aab che mastana mi rabat maninde kahkashan wa gariban mardazar dar khab e naz bud wa gawara e sahab wa kard chashme shauq ba hosh eko husar as-sang reza nagma kushayat kharam u semaye u hu aynae berang u beghwar. So you can see the rhythm of the stream flowing. And so this is the thing about Gizan Muhammad. It was incomplete. He could have completed it. So this is this interaction that we talk about. We talk about interfaith dialogue. We need inter-civilizational dialogue that Iqbal had started. And this inter-civilizational dialogue picks up those themes and those elements and those people that have resonance with us. Goethe has resonance with us. Why? One of the things he said was that nations are made by poets. And Iqbal is the architect of the new Islamic millet, if I may say so. So this is, you can say that Goethe was the architect of the German nation. He is the mushtahid of that nation. He was able to weld those different principalities and religions, Catholic and others, on the basis of his works, of his literary work and his poetry, and he was wide enough to understand the East and to embrace the elements of the East that he found attractive. The second person that you may relate to in this country, And the resonance is not that much, but it is to an extent, because both did political things. And that is, that would be, who would that be? Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson lived again for about 83 years, so he had a long life. And he was a man of politics, as you know. But, you know, 1743 to 1826, again, is that same cusp. A little earlier, he was the first president, I'm sorry, the second vice president, and then after that the president, he was preceded by others. He was also the second governor of Virginia, and he wrote, you know, many things, but one of the most important things is supposed to be the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. And so he conceived of a nation born in independence and liberty, just as Iqbal dreamt of Pakistan as an independent nation, which Jinnah said would be the what? The laboratory for Islam. So one of the other parallels, of course, Jefferson, you know, was deeply into politics. He was governor, he was Secretary of State, he was president, he was vice president. So he knew it all. He was also the ambassador in France, you know, so he was witness to the French Revolution, revolutionary ideas that ended in the French Revolution. But he was also very devoted to his wife, who didn't live long, who lived maybe into her 20s, developed diabetes and other problems, and died after the birth of the last child. And then, so he wrote on, besides the epitaph, he wrote, and she's buried in where? Anybody know? Yes, Monticello. Another thing about him is that this fellow, Jefferson, was also the founder of the University of Virginia, just as Iqbal was interested and worked for Islamic College, Railway Road in Lahore, and was the Anjuman Islam, and also in Aligarh. So I'm trying to give you these connections, so you don't feel alienated. You find Jefferson to be a friend in some ways, and just as others would find Iqbal as a friend and understand where he was coming from. So he wrote on Martha Jefferson's gravestone, headstone, epitaph, and then in Greek. And the translation of that Greek is from the Iliad. Nay, if ever the house of Hades, the dead forget the dead. That means in Jahannam, the dead forget the dead. Yet will I, even there, be mindful of my dear comrade. So you can see this profound love that he had for his wife. And so you see the similar sentiment, even though this is not a sentiment for a spouse, but it is a sentiment for another loved person in Iqbal's life, that was his mother. And he wrote a long one when she died in 1914, on the same day he was born, which is 9th of November well, he was born in 1877, but 9th of November was when he was born. His mother died the same November date. And so he wrote Walda Marhuma ki yaad mein, and of course anyone who has lost a mother, their mother would profit from reading this profound love of a child for the mother. And said, Jab tere daman mein balti thi wo jaane na tama, baat se achhi tarah mahram na thi jiski zaban, aur ab charche hain, because he became famous. He's probably the only PhD in the entire movement, front leaders of the movement for the freedom of South Asia. The others were just lawyers. He was not only a lawyer, like Jefferson, he was also a lawyer, and also Goethe had studied law. So he was a lawyer, but he was also he was a PhD in philosophy. And so in that way, it is true to say, aur ab charche hain jiski shokhi-e guftar ke, became a famous poet. Bebaha moti hain jiski chashme gauhar bar ke. Then he describes his presence with his mother. Ilm ki sanjeeda guftari, budhape ka shaur, deenvi एजाज की शौकत, जवानी का गरूर, जिंदगी की औज गाहों से उतर आते हैं हम. We descend from the heights that we have climbed in the world, in the presence of our mothers. Suhbate madar mein tifl sada reh jate hain, we become simple children with our mothers. Betakalluf khundazan hai, smiling, fikr se azad hain, फिर उसी खोए हुए फिरदौस में आबाद हैं. And then his lament is, किसको अब होगा वतन में आह मेरा इंतजार, कौन मेरा खत न आने से रहेगा बेकरार, खाके बरकत पर तेरी लेकर ये फरियाद आऊंगा, अब दुआए नीम शब में, you remember you talked about tahajjud, अब दुआए नीम शब में किसको मैं याद आऊंगा. So this is this connection you can see of this profound love for somebody. And the translation briefly is, who would wait for me anxiously in my native place? Who would be restless if my letters fail to arrive? I will visit thy grave with this complaint. Who will now think of me in the midnight prayer? All thy life you served me with devotion. Then I became fit to serve thee. Thou hast departed. So this was the second connection that here in the West you can introduce Iqbal through that mechanism. And the third is the controversial figure of Friedrich Nietzsche, who was born in 1844, died in 1900, and lived a very brief life of 55 years less than Iqbal. Of course, he was at the cusp, or just the end of the 19th century, and he studied philosophy, metaphysics, psychology, and so forth. And one of the earliest books that he wrote had to do with the Greek tragedy. And he came up with this idea of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Apollonian is the sober thinking part of the human, represented by God Apollo. And the Dionysian is that impulse that is unfettered by rational thought, the emotional aspect of human life, which is Dionysian and sometimes cruel. And if you see in Iqbal, you see that resonance. Not that Iqbal took from him, but he had his own thought about this. And he brings it in relationship to our own tradition. बेखतर डूब पड़ा, कूद पड़ा, आतिशे तमन्नी में इश्क, अक्ल है, मैं वे तमाशाई लबे बाम अक्ल है, लाजिम है, दिल के पास है, पासवान का लेकिन कभी कभी You see the Apollonian and the Dionysian divide here, that is a parallel. And if you explain it to people in that way, not that there is an element of taking, because Iqbal was very critical of Nietzsche in many ways. And of course, Nietzsche was a materialist, and he said, Na'uzubillah, the God is dead. And the reason he said that was that the Abrahamic God in the Western civilization had no meaning left in the lives of people. They did what they wanted to do, they conquered other people, they destroyed them, people became restless, they lost their works, jobs after the industrialist revolution. Children were brought in from the villages and they worked all hours in the factories of England. You see, that's how that nation became great. And people died. If you read Dickens, you get the picture of that industrial time. And so that is why God was dead for the Western civilization. So, but Iqbal was critical of Nietzsche in the sense. Nietzsche died of a dementing illness. So his detractors said he had syphilis, but he had never really been with women. He was not somebody, perhaps he was a little autistic. Well, he was very sensitive. His breakdown was when he saw this horse being whipped, and he rushed to it and collapsed to put himself between the whipper of the horse and the horse himself. And then he was taken to Switzerland and he deteriorated after that. And for 10 years, then finally he died. So now we think that he may have a disease called Calyceal, because he had severe migraines, he lost his vision. or he may have what we call frontal lobe dementia. But his Superman or Ubermensch was very different from what Iqbal. Iqbal is related to Insan-e-Kamil, which is not Iqbal's term, it has been there before him, referring to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Abdul Karim Jili.
Yeah, exactly. Even before that. Sabak phir pada, and Iqbal's Mard-e-Mumin or Jama Mard is different. There is integrity, there is faith, there is optimism, there is courage, there is yaqeen, and many other elements that go, it doesn't mean it's a male necessarily, it's the mindset of being Mard-e-Khuda, Jama Mard, Mard-e-Mumin. So what is that Mard-e-Mumin? Sabak phir pad sadaqat ka, adalat ka, shujaat ka, courageous. Liya jayega tujhse kaam, dunya ki imamat ka. So then we see that he is critical of Nietzsche. He says, अगर होता वो मजलूब फरंगी इस ज़माने में इकबाल उसको समझाता मुकाम किबरिया क्या है, what is the Superman? And then he actually has a poem in Zarb Kalim entitled Hakim Nietzsche.
Muhammad Kibriya is Insan-e-Kamil.
Is the Ubermensch, the Superman, or in his thing. हरीफ़े नुक्ताए तौहीद वो सका न हकीम निगाह चाहिए असरारे ला इलाह के लिए दंगे सीनाए गर्दू है उसका फिक्र बुलंद कमन उसका तखय्युल है महरुमाह के लिए अगरचे पाक है तीनत में राह भी उसकी तरस रही है मगर लज्जत गुनाह के लिए. He was a materialist. He was interested in what satisfied his desires, his bodily desires, rather than rising to things higher. So, and I think we heard the poem already about Surat na Parastamman, Mutkhana Shikastamman. That sort of tells you again that how that is different from Nietzsche. So then I finally want to just touch on the other context of present day context in Iqbal, and that has to do with the divisiveness that we face today in our world and also in the Ummah. And Iqbal was beyond and above these schisms. And I said these are the three mushtahids that I picked up from the Western civilization, and I want to submit to you a controversial point that you may find controversial, but I'm quite comfortable with it now, having tested it first at the consulate in Pakistani consulate here, and then with other sahab. And that is that I think Iqbal was a great mujtahid, and his greatest ijtihad was Pakistan. And he said that the Khilafah is not necessarily a person, that it can be an institution. And I think this is the greatest political ijtihad since the time of the Khawarij. You see, in the Muslim toolbox, there are many responses that are thrown at them. One of the early responses was when they conquered Persia and they conquered Iran, the greatest civilization of that time. And Iqbal has talked about when the greatest civilization met this faith, this pure, hard, simple, direct faith, connection directly with God, both were changed forever. And that change that occurred in Damascus and that occurred in Iran or Najaf derailed the political process of growth in Islam. And according to Bella, who just died recently, he was an American sociologist, and his work was drawn, my attention was drawn to him by Dr. Koshal, Basit Koshal, who is himself a sociologist and has 2 PhDs on Max Weber. And Bella says in his article in this book called Beyond Belief about Islam is that Islam's greatest rise in political idea and development was at the time of Umar, President of Islam. And beyond that, you start to see a decline. First problem that arises if you look at it from modern political theory is that at the time of Usman was the issue of term limits. There was no concept of term limit, and that led to fitna. And then arose the problem of hereditary rule, adopted both in Damascus and also in Kufa. And that was another deleterious backward step for the Islamic political system to move on. But this was a response in the toolbox of the Muslims to these great superpowers of that time. It would be like today if the Muslims had conquered Washington and Moscow at the same time. So that response may have been appropriate at that time, but we don't need that response anymore. We don't need Shia and Ali. We don't need the Deoband. We don't need Qum. They're good responses for their time. But those responses are no longer fit the scheme of things of today. Ismailism was a response to the philosophical challenge of Greece and Rome. And Jews had faced that, and Christians had faced that. Philo of Alexandria, the Jew, had written about that from the Jewish point of view. And the church fathers had written about that when they faced this speculative philosophy. And so Muslims, when they were faced with the speculative philosophy, they responded to it through Ismailism, in a sense. The Khawarij also was a response to this hereditary rule. And their followers, the Ibadis, if you see, they have adopted this idea of term limits for the Imam or for the ruler. And I was reading this book written by an American scholar, a woman from Indiana, who in her PhD thesis, she wrote about how the Ibadis have come forward with their term limits. And also responsibility of the ruler, if he does not follow the Sharia, then they remove it. So we have to learn from all these different things that happened. Wahhabism was a response to colonial attack on Islam and also on the deterioration of belief and the creation of substations of Makkah and Medina and other places that had become holy. So that was a response to that. We don't need that now because we have a jet that can take us directly to close to Mecca or directly to Medina. We can go and do our tawaf and we can go to the Masjid al-Nabi. We don't need to go around and do tawaf around anything else. So you can see that these are old clothes that we need to shed. And Iqbal tells us how to shed those clothes. So he's a great mujtahid, a great political mujtahid of the 20th century, like of which the Muslim world has not seen for a very long time. Without being sectarian, without being... the reason I say that is the proof. And the proof is that the Iranians adopted him with both arms. That Khamenei said this is like, na'uzubillah, like Wahi descending upon him. That Ali Shariati was indebted to him. That they showed Khomeini and Shariati and Iqbal on the same platform as their inspiration. And he's also inspiring the Palestinians and the Central Asians. So, and in China, somebody said, right? So, one thing that none of you know, that I'm going to tell you that I did also not know, because it's unpublished Iqbal's work about China.
Wow.
You want to hear it?
Yes.
So in the Song dynasty, and I have to check my recording here. And I said to a colleague of mine, I said, tell this to the ambassador, because he knows the ambassador here, that they should put this on that grave of this famous Chinese leader. And so let me find this. This was on the execution of Wen Tianxiang, Wen Tianxiang was a scholar, general, and subsequent hero of the Song dynasty. He was executed in he lived between 1236 and 1283. He was executed by the invading Mongol army. Because he was so well known and he was so courageous, everybody wanted him on the side, and so did the Mongols. So they captured him.